Yuma. Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the National Library of Australia. My name is Alison Dellett, and I'm the Acting Director-General here at the National Library, while Dr. Marie-Louise Ayres takes a very well-earned break. Before I continue, can everybody please check to make sure that your mobile phones are on silent, especially our panel, or switched off entirely is an option for those who can. I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional owners of the land on which we live and work. I'll pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I would like to extend that respect to all First Nations peoples with us tonight. Given our topic, I'd like to particularly thank and acknowledge the many fierce, strong Ngunnawal women who have made this a safe and welcoming meeting place for millennia. It is my pleasure to introduce one of my favourite events in association with our 1975 Living in the 70s exhibition. Tonight is a rare chance to reflect on a moment in history that reshaped Australia's social and political fabric, and one that has a legacy that we are still unfolding today. In the late 60s and early 1970s, women across the country stood out, spoke up, and demanded change. They fought for equal pay, legal abortion, accessible childcare, the right to ongoing employment, the right to control their own money, and the associated right to live free from violence and discrimination. And in an era where femininity was associated with docility and gentleness, they were unapologetic and bold, embracing descriptions like brazen to redefine who we were allowed to be. The documentary Brazen Hussies captures this era with integrity and with heart. Directed by Dwyer, the film traces the rise of the women's liberation movement in Australia from 1965 to 1975. It brings together archival footage and personal stories. It's a record of courage, confrontation, and transformation. Tonight, before we screen the film, we're very fortunate to hear from 4 women who were central to this movement and have remained so, as activists, thinkers, storytellers, and genuine change makers. We, of course, have Dwyer, writer, director and producer of Brazen Hussies. We have Elizabeth Reid, appointed by Coff Whitlam as the world's first advisor on women's affairs to a head of government in 1973. Elizabeth's career has been groundbreaking throughout her life. And we have the inimitable Biff Ward, activist, writer and feminist trailblazer whose early involvement in the movement and ongoing work for justice have helped shape the country we live in today. Our facilitator this evening is Virginia Haussegger, award-winning journalist, broadcaster and staunch advocate for gender equality, who has just released her new book, Unfinished Revolution, The Feminist Fight Back, if someone wants to hold it up. Which, of course, you may purchase in the best bookshop in Canberra, which is just upstairs. The National Library very proudly also holds the papers of Elizabeth Reid here in Parkes, documenting not only her groundbreaking role, but also the activities associated with the 1975 International Women's Year. This is a fabulous collection, including diaries, notebooks, articles and press cuttings, a huge range of materials relating to women, our lives and successes, and our fight for an equal playing field. Please join me in welcoming Dwyer, Elizabeth Reid, Biff Ward and Virginia Haussegger.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alison. What a beautiful, warm welcome. I too, of course, would like to open by acknowledging the beautiful lands that we live on and thank the Ngunnawal people for the many, many, many thousands of years of caring for these lands. How lucky are we? But how lucky are we to be here tonight? I feel very excited about this conversation. For those of you who haven't seen the film Brazen Hussies, you are in for an incredible treat. I, of course, have seen it, but I could see it over and over and watch it over and over and over again. And we're also hearing from 2 of those women very central to this story. So there's a great deal we can talk about tonight, and we're all sort of bristling with so many thoughts about how we want to cover this. We've only got 40 minutes or so, and then we do want to make sure that we hear from you, because we're used to speaking about this period and these issues, and we could all talk all night. You could have well and truly gone, and we'd still be talking. But it always is fascinating to all of us as to what others think and what other concerns people bring to this discussion, and what other observations people bring to this discussion, and questions. So I want to be sure to give you time to ask your questions. So don't hold back, please. And being Canberra, no one holds back. Not for long anyway. I'd like to open by asking Catherine Dwyer, the filmmaker of Brazen Hussies, and I'm very, very excited to actually meet Catherine. We've been talking for a long time. It's the first time we've met in person. This film blew my mind when it came out. So November 2020, this was a very important period in Australia in regard to what I call a changing or a national consciousness raising. We really hit a crest around late 2020 and, of course, 2021 with the March for Justice. But I want to throw open first to Catherine to tell us a little bit about why you, as a filmmaker, why you were drawn to this story, to this period, to these women, given all the sorts of things that you could have been focusing on as a documentary filmmaker. Why this story?
Thanks, Virginia. And it's such a pleasure to be here. It's such an honour. And the film did come out almost 5 years ago, so it's a perfect complement to the 1975 exhibition. And I'm so pleased that people are still interested in watching it. I'm going to answer your question, but I just wanted to see how many people in the room had actually seen the film already. Oh, wonderful.
So it's quite a few. And for those who are watching or can't see the audience watching this streamed, I think that's probably about a quarter, maybe? Maybe a third have seen it? Okay.
Yeah, so I actually probably don't think of myself as a filmmaker. I mean, this was the first film I ever made, and I don't know if I'll ever make another one. I think I just really wanted to know the story of the women's liberation movement. And I dived in head first and bit off way more than I could chew. I just went straight into a feature documentary. But the background to that is that I had had conversations with women my own age who didn't identify with the term feminism. And that sort of made me sort of double down on identifying as a feminist, and also wondering, like, what is being forgotten or lost? Like, why is feminism a dirty word?
Can I just clarify what age period you're talking about? I'm not asking you to tell us your age necessarily, but are you talking about millennial women?
Yeah, I'm 43, so I was born in 82, and I'm definitely a daughter of the second wave movement. My mother is the same age as Biff and Elizabeth, and she was a feminist. She wasn't an activist, though. She wasn't in the movement, but she's definitely influenced by it. But basically, I ended up living in New York, and there was a filmmaker there who was doing a crowdfunding campaign to raise money for a film about the American women's liberation movement. And I just got goosebumps when I saw the trailer. And I saw they were based in Brooklyn, and I contacted them and made them take me on as an intern. And it completely changed my life. And one thing that's really important for me, like why did I make this film, is that working with that director, she was a mentor, and she showed me that it was possible. And I think, women's stories and women in positions of power, are so important, because I definitely would have just thought about it and wondered about it, but never actually tried to do it.
So, given that background and your intention of really sort of unpacking the story around feminism and women's liberation, what was the most difficult aspect of trying to tell this story? When you sat down at the beginning, what were you up against?
Yeah, it was definitely an ambitious project to try and tell the story of a social movement, and to not have any main characters and to not have a narrator, because I wanted it to be told by the women who lived it. So it was, that was in the grappling with that was in the editing phase, but it had taken 5 years to get to that stage. So I had a lot of time for research, and I do love research, and I got deep into that. Going back to your first question about why did I do this, I've been thinking about that a lot lately. Like, it's been a while since I made it, and I'm sort of despairing about the state of the world. And I did wonder, like, why did I get so obsessed with uncovering this history? I mean, I felt very passionately that, why didn't I know it? And I didn't know any of the women. Had never heard of Anne Summers. I definitely
hadn't heard of Anne Summers?
No, and I didn't know.
Wow.
I didn't know about Elizabeth Reid. So reading about Elizabeth Reid being appointed the first advisor to a head of state anywhere in the world was incredible. I was like mesmerised by this story.
That is so extraordinary to me that you didn't know the women who ended up being absolutely central to your story, because your film has now become, for a much younger generation, their awakening to this story and these women. And I've actually sat some students down to watch it over the past recent years, and they didn't know about Elizabeth Reid. So, yeah, it's a beautiful line of connection there.
Definitely. And it's so thinking about why, because I am feeling a little bit despairing of the current climate and the state of the world.
You're not the only one.
Yes, I think we all are. What drew me to uncovering this, because I obviously knew that it happened, and we knew certain things about second wave women's movement, and it did have a huge impact on the world, but I wanted to go to the roots of it and like find out how a grassroots movement that happened with the women's movement, takes place, because it really is such a rare occasion that a grassroots social movement takes off like wildfire, like the women's liberation movement did in the 70s.
So, coming back to my question about what was difficult about it, what was hard about it, what
Everything.
everything. I get that. I understand that. But did you find, first and foremost, did you find women willing to talk?
Definitely, and there was I have to give credit to Jocelyn Scutt, because she edited a book called Different Lives, and it is incredible. And so many women that I interviewed wrote a chapter of that book. Biff and Elizabeth, and Lilla Watson, and if only Pat Eatock were alive, because her chapter is incredible. But what was difficult? And I said everything. Well, actually, accessing the oral histories at the National Library was not difficult. It was fantastic.
Yeah.
And I was able to do such useful research through them. And, Biff had done a lot of the interviews and had done her own oral history.
I'm just going to jump in on that too, and I'd say absolutely ditto for this book. And I've spent the last 2 years in this library, and I feel like I own various seats and desks because I've been here for so long. But the oral histories that the National Library of Australia has put together, collected and collated over years are utter gold. To hear, because I also sat and listened to hours upon hours upon hours of oral history before I interviewed some of the women I've interviewed, and it just brings alive, particularly for the women who have passed, brings alive these stories. So thank goodness the National Library has done that. I'll move on now to two of the stars of this film. I want to ask you about your experience of being part of Catherine's film. Now, Elizabeth, to you first, I imagine there were aspects of going back in your mind to talk about this period that would have been tough. Because, well, we can come to this a little bit later, but you had a pretty tough time when you were in the role that Catherine spoke about as advisor to the Prime Minister Gough Whitlam. But what was the experience of doing the interview for this film like for you all those years later?
Let me answer it on a number of levels. I found it very difficult personally because I had been, this was 2020, wasn't it? When did you start
The film
the
came out
interview?
in 2020, but I interviewed you in 2017.
2017. Yes, so in 2009 I was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and I felt my speech was going. And I listened to it today and I can hear it. But so for me it was a real strain to try to make sure that I could cope with it. And for Catherine, I think I didn't realise at the time, but I was only her second interviewee. So
I was very nervous.
But so me trying to hold my voice out there, and Catherine trying to control me. I mean, to get me to say what she wanted me to say. That was a very awkward thing. Now, the question was?
The experience of being interviewed, but I think we're interested to hear how you felt about it when you saw it.
When I saw it, I felt, I mean, it was an extraordinary film. It brought back all sorts of memories, and it's truly a document of the times. I mean, Catherine's made a real effort to get archival footage, so you can see some footage there that you didn't even know that existed. And so seeing it was a tremendous pleasure. Yeah.
I would imagine it would be, because it is such a good film. Biff, what about you? What was the experience of being interviewed like, and how did you feel about it when you saw the film?
Well, the first thing I'd tell you is that I'd been interviewed by quite a few people over preceding years about this or that, or Pine Gap Women's Camp or something. And while a lot of those experiences were pleasurable, overall, mostly I felt like I wasn't really on the same page with the person, or they hadn't done a lot of research, or they'd done research wasn't where my thoughts were. So I was actually expecting very little.
No offence, Catherine, no
Shocking.
offence.
So that's a bit of hubris for you. And then,
But that's a very fair comment.
yeah,
though.
yeah.
A very
So
fair comment.
Catherine arrived with her team of 4 other women. These 5 women just came and took over my house, and it seemed like hours. I don't know if it was 1 or 2, but it seemed like 3 or 4 just to set up. Took make it into a film studio, and then they sat me in this chair, and one of them was hiding behind the sofa, who was doing sound or something, so she didn't distract me. It was, sort of fun and interesting to me. And Catherine stood, I think, sat in quite a way in front of me and started to ask me these questions. And she'd say things like, now, in 1971, you wrote bloody, bloody, blah. And I'm going, did I?
Did I say that? Really?
And there was a lot of that. I was so impressed with the amount and depth of the research. And I think overall, I actually regret that I hadn't known it was going to be like that, so I could have prepared more. I would have said more interesting and useful things.
Oh,
but no,
yeah.
seriously, I was just, on the surface of memories and good feelings and things, rather than having really thought about some of the things she brought up, which I hadn't talked about for years.
I understand what you mean, and I think we all feel that when we've been interviewed. I know I certainly do. But the story you're telling is new to people, and they don't know the bits that you haven't told, but it is nevertheless new to people and very compelling. I want to also come back to the point you just made about, 5 women come in and they're rearranging your house and all that sort of stuff. As a television journalist myself, I know that can be obviously very confronting to people, and often invariably put them a little bit offside, such that they become a bit formal in their speech. And that struck me when I first watched Brazen Hussies, is how incredibly open the women were with whoever it was who was interviewing him, which was obviously you, Catherine. But no one was just giving what we call giving grabs, just saying lines, delivering talking points or answering a question. All of the interviews are really revealing, animated, and you can tell that the interviewee is 100% focused on the story. And it's really hard as an interviewer to get people to that point. So you do something very special. What is it?
I don't know.
I could answer some of that. Like, they were so friendly, particularly Catherine. They were just friendly and warm and laughing, and it felt fun. And also, as I indicated, I was fascinated by what do you do, and and one of them went into another room and shut the door, and she was crucial somehow. So I was kind of engaged at that level. Just what are these women doing? And it was kind of fun.
It's gorgeous. I just coming to one of the core themes of Brazen Hussies, we're talking about liberation. Now, I'd like to hear from all of you about how you separated the idea of liberation from equality. And you brought this out really beautifully in the film, Catherine, or you do bring it out. This was not just, I shouldn't say just, but this was not about women fighting for equality and gender equality. This was something quite different. This was about women and liberation. Can you just pick up on that theme a little bit? And I'd like to hear from both Elizabeth and Biff about this.
Yeah, I mean, going back to that idea of what makes a grassroots movement take off and ignite like that, I think it's remarkable as well. And maybe the interviews went so well because we were all so excited to talk about it. I mean, the women that I interviewed were thrilled to talk about it, and it was like this, we've got this secret thing that we had to record and share and spread. So yeah, that's where the passion came from, because it was so exciting. It's like, this is really important and people need to know about this.
And no one had done this. No one had told this story in broadcast before.
Yeah, not quite in this very ambitious way to try and describe a whole movement. But I guess the movement is the main character of the film. And when I thought about how am I going to edit the story together, it was so hard to have a cohesive narrative that runs through it. I decided to frame it in the same way that social movements happen, like it's been documented. They sort of emerge, and then they explode, and then they sort of coalesce and become bureaucratised, and I thought that would be an interesting way to sort of follow the movement. But in terms of liberation, I don't know. I think I'd rather hear from them.
Well, Elizabeth, I'll throw that one to you now. You've always been very clear about this, and certainly in my book we talk about this a lot because you kept repeating over the years you and I have spoken, is that that the quest wasn't about equality. And in fact, and I'll just make this point very quickly, but one of the most powerful speeches I have ever heard in my life and ever read, and I have probably read 1,000, was the speech that Elizabeth Reid gave in 1975 at the UN World Conference on Women. And it was held in Mexico. It was the very first World Conference on Women in Australia. And Elizabeth was the head of the Australian delegation. And she spoke very early on in this conference, and in that speech, which is a landmark speech which historians still talk about, and in fact one of them said to me when I was writing my book that that speech stands today, 50 years later. She said, you wouldn't change any of it. But Elizabeth, in the speech, speaking to the United Nations, spoke very strongly about why equality can in fact, the quest for equality can in fact be dangerous, can in fact wind things back for women. Can you pick up on that a little bit, Elizabeth?
Yes, well, the question of equality versus something else was the quest that the women's liberation movement undertook here in Canberra, in the Canberra Women's Lib, that what are we trying to achieve? And there was, this is in fact relevant to the gulf between WEL and women's liberation movement. We felt that it relates to the reform versus revolution, which we saw as a dilemma at a particular stage in history. Briefly, we were not fighting for equality. Equality to us meant making women like men and putting them into a man-created world, a world created by men for men. That's a bit crude, but that's roughly, I think, how we felt. And so we weren't fighting or striving towards equality. And we also felt that it wasn't about, equality is about pies and things like this, getting an equal share of the pie. But we wanted something, we wanted to free women. We wanted to allow women the possibility of creativity, of forming a world in which women would like to live as well as men. And so the concept of liberation was very important for us. And in fact, in Canberra Women's Lib, we tended to use the word women's liberation, that's what we're for, more than we use the description of ourselves as feminists. We did at times use that, but we were members of the women's liberation movement.
I think that's beautifully put. Biff, the idea of liberation, and then I think you can take us to revolution.
Okay. I think the work that you've done, Catherine, and your book have helped me realise more of what I think about these things and find better words. And I think that it's now very clear to me that liberation compared with the fight for equality, and some equalities are good, we know that. Of course they're good, we want them. But they're just little steps on the way. And that liberation is actually about, it's revolutionary because it's about the end of sexism. Which I think sometimes we can vaguely imagine or make ourselves have an imaginal little thing and imagine a world without sexism or racism. I'm going to get tearful too. Old ladies do. Right?
All ladies do.
We get even more, I promise you. So to me that's a really helpful way to understand what I mean by liberation is an end to sexism, which may never be able to come, but imagining a world without rape. So go on, ask me something.
A world without sexism, yes, we can get there. Of course we can. We can do that.
What I want to say is that I think, there was women's liberation and very quickly WEL and the whole of fight for equality, and we were a bit different then. Some women were in both. Years later, when Susan Ryan organised a conference and we were all there, we sort of went, we're all doing the same thing really, there's differences sort of. But when we talk like this, I think they're still there for me. Yeah. They're very important. And I've always said I'm a women's liberationist. And I think that what's happened in the last 10 years with Me Too and so on, and all the stuff you do so beautifully in your book, and that March for Justice moment in Australian history, that all of that is really a return to this concept of liberation. It's way beyond equality. That kind of anger and awareness of sexual predation and what it does to us. So I think, and I just want to really honour the work you've done, both of you. And I think you started it, and your book just takes off from Catherine's film and does such a good job. Everyone must get many copies and give them all.
Thank you. Catherine, you...
Yeah, I just wanted to say that what Biff and Elizabeth have just said reminds me of a really powerful image that was in an essay I read by Aunt Lilla Watson, who's a Koori woman, and she drew a Venn diagram of Koori culture, where there is a circle which is men's business, there's a circle that is women's business, and then they intersect, and in the middle is community business. And then her diagram of Western culture, mainstream culture, was a circle, and that was men's business, and inside that circle was a smaller circle, which was women. And I just was blown away by that because it just totally nailed it, that women had been colonised in our culture, and we don't define ourselves. And so that idea of liberation is sort of getting away from that, being defined by a dominant...
It's very interesting. I mean, that image of the Venn diagrams is so powerful. And Elizabeth, I know, touched on this many, many years ago in writing about it too, that women are a colonised sex. The issue of sexism, and I just want to come back to this because it's an important point about the speech I mentioned that Elizabeth gave in 1975 at the UN World Conference on Women. Elizabeth was the very first person to raise the issue of sexism to the UN.
Even the word.
The word sexism. Yeah, sorry, not just the issue, but the word. And in her speech talked about sexism and defined what it was. That had never been done before, ever. And this was, a global stage. And again, historians, certainly those that I've interviewed, still talk about that as being a pivotal moment for women around the globe, because that changed the language of the UN. And interestingly, since then, there were 4 World Conferences on Women, 75, 80, 85 and 95, the famous one that Hillary Clinton spoke at about women's rights being human rights and human rights being women's rights. Each of those conferences picked up on that theme of sexism that Elizabeth Reid had brought into the discussion, and it changed. It changed the conversation. It actually changed national action plans. It did shift enormously global thinking, slowly, but it did actually make that shift. So I think that's an important point to make. But just coming back to revolution versus reform, this is an interesting one too, because at times there was a bit of push and pull among women back then, and when we're talking the period of the early women's liberation period in the early 70s, a bit of push and pull as to what was appropriate. Reform, as in you try to get in the tent, become part of the government bureaucracy and make change that way, or do you stay outside the tent and metaphorically, throw rocks and create havoc? Tell us a little bit about how that was argued within the women's liberation movement.
I don't really remember.
Maybe it's more of a hindsight thing.
Because I didn't ever have any doubt in myself. I was very clear I couldn't do that other thing.
Well, let me try and do something here. Well said they weren't interested in revolution or changes, quite explicitly. What we want to do is achieve certain things. So they would put in a submission on the family law bill, on how to end marriage with dignity, put in submission on compensation schemes, put in commission on childcare. And childcare, they asked me if they could bring a delegation in to meet with the Prime Minister. So I said, would you meet with them? And he agreed. And so they brought in a delegation. I took them in and they met with the Prime Minister. So it was like they wanted to achieve specific things. Well, we wanted to see if we could work out what things would actually lead to an improvement in women's lives and what things wouldn't. I mean, we know there are lots and lots of initiatives, so-called, that don't in fact improve women's lives. In fact, may have quite the opposite effect. They could be quite harmful towards women. So the problem, and I was a member of both organisations, as I had to be in my job. The problem with Well is that it's a simplification of the task, of the challenge that you're faced with. And with the simplification of the task there comes a simplification of the analysis. And so Well would claim, on the basis of one meeting with the Prime Minister, which in fact was a disaster on the Prime Minister. Prime Minister raged out of that meeting, "Don't you ever bring a delegation like that in to see me?" Blah, blah, blah. And I got whipped. And Well went public and said, "We've got childcare," when the Prime Minister introduced childcare into the next... It was the only policy change when he went to the election in 1974. He said to his staff, before he just disappeared off the face of the earth, he said, "We have to go back to people. We're being forced back to people. We are not going to change a single plank in our policy platform." And I thought, oh, shit. Anyway, he disappeared. He disappeared with his speechwriter and his secretary and so on. So I said to Caroline Summerhayes, his secretary, I said, "Oh, Caroline, I think, given that the boss has disappeared, it's school holidays, so I need to take my daughter for a holiday. I barely see her these days." And she said, "Well, why don't you go and ask such and such an MP from the Gold Coast up in Queensland? He'll tell you a nice place to go." So she organised him to come and see me, and I got my daughter and a friend of hers, and we went up to the Gold Coast. We arrived late at night. Excuse me. Got up the next morning and I said to Catherine, "I think we'd better walk down to the shop and get something that we can eat for breakfast." We're walking down the beach. There comes the Prime Minister out of water.
And she says it was a holiday. Yeah, right.
I said, "I don't believe it. I just don't believe it." And he was shocked to see me. He was as shocked to see me as I was to see him. And so we chatted for a little while, and I said to him, "Boss, there's just one thing I need to say to you. And that is there's one policy that you must change this election."
And he did.
And he did.
He did.
$94 million to childcare, which is community-controlled, community-based, non-profit oriented, blah, 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 everything that we don't have now. And if you think that we have a childcare policy now, you're very badly mistaken. We don't. We have a policy, a set of programs that bleed parents dry, and don't and open their children up for abuse and all sorts of other things. So
we could talk about this for ages, but I just want to come back to the issue of reform and revolution. And Elizabeth, towards the end of your time working with the Prime Minister, I suspect it was so intense. It was such an intense period of social change. Women's liberation had really gained a lot of momentum. Women had been changed during the early 70s. Women had changed, which was really what you'd set out to do, for women to change and to redesign lives in which they could flourish. But I'm wondering, did it ever become for you? You left in October of 1975. In that you left that role and then left Australia. Did you feel that it had become too hard to try and being a liberationist at heart, having revolution in your veins, which you still do, and also working within a bureaucracy that had all sorts of roadblocks along the way? Did it feel like it was just too difficult?
To be quite honest, I think it should have felt like that because the answer was that it was. But I was still hopeful. We had two things that we needed to do to round off International Women's Year, at which stage I would have had to take stock anyway. All right, what am I going to do now? I've finished that period. The two things we missed out on, well, after Mexico City, we came back to Australia. And the first thing we did, which was radical, absolutely radical, was we held a conference on women's health in a changing society. 950 women, mainly women, turned up to it. And we included a special sub-conference for Aboriginal women. We bought in, we subsidised hundreds of them to come. And I was just thinking today that it's hard to put ourselves back in what it was like to be a woman in 1975 in terms of one's health. It was a day of Bex and Valium and was stuffed into us and so on.
And
Do you know there were no drug trials in the whole world? There wasn't a single drug trial that involved women. All drugs were tried on men, tried on men.
These things, this is why it's so important to talk about this time period, because, I mean, your generation, my generation, have taken it for granted for a long time that progress is inevitable. You know, it happens eventually, things will improve. What I think we're hearing here, and certainly what I've found in researching my book and interviewing so many women and through Catherine's amazing film, is that revolution is hard work and it never stops. And Biff, you said to me at one stage when we were talking in the very early days when I was interviewing you, revolution is something that we live. We live the revolution. It's not something we aim for. And Elizabeth had said the same things, had written the same things over years. But I must admit, I found that fascinating. I hadn't thought about it like that. But what is fascinating to me is that you all still live revolution. Well, you do. And part of that is the way you have this connection to sisterhood, I think.
Yes. An original badge.
Oh.
It's powerful.
Sisterhood is powerful.
Yeah. And that was the other thing I wanted to throw in about the reform versus revolution. Women's liberation, the revolutionary side, operated through the use of what we came to call sisterhood. It was about listening. It was about valuing it. I mean, of course we messed it up and failed and it wasn't perfect. But the idea was to listen to every woman's story and give it equal value to every other woman's story. And I think some of us, I mean, I feel like if I still live the revolution, it's partly that I was trained through that to be a listener and to enjoy being with other women, and so you know that becomes part. And I won't go into some of the stories I've heard over the years, but mostly I think often the operation of different was far more traditional and formal and
hierarchical.
Had motions and things. And of course, because they were women together, of course they had the experience of telling those stories and getting close. As you've mapped of some of the young women who've been speaking out in recent years, having amazing experiences of sisterhood, or they don't have that word for it, but you know, it happens. So the living the revolution was also because so many of us came out of what I now call the old male left, which I'm sure some of you have experienced, and that was so hierarchical and so invested in splitting hairs and having the right line and so on. And so we, from the very beginning, said we're not going to do that. We want a world where people are equal, and so we're going to behave that way. That's going to be built into everything that we do. And I think I see that coming back in these young women. And I think it was crucial to what fascinated you, like, you know, this how they operated and how they treated each other.
People power. It was a leaderless movement, and it was quite amusing when men from the media would try to engage in the movement, and they would call up and ask to speak to the president of the Women's Liberation Movement.
The president. Yes. We haven't actually touched on media. I do want to take some questions from you. Kelly and Sharon are roving with mics. If you have a question, please pop your hand up very quickly. And as you do that, I will just add to that. Yes, the issue of media, and we could talk about this for days, was huge because the misogyny in media and the sexism was so extreme. I thought I'd seen a lot, but boy, oh boy, I was so shocked when I went back and looked at it. And Biff, as you were talking, it reminded me there was a moment in 1975 when women rose up here in Canberra. It was during the Women in Politics conference. It was actually on the 5th of September 1975. Women got so pissed off with the media treatment of women that a couple of hundred left the conference which was at ANU at the time, and marched into the offices of the Canberra Times to protest. And that's a great story, and I tell it in the book. But what was fascinating for me to learn about that is that actually is the only time women en masse have made a protest against a news organisation. And because Biff and others went on that night to try and stop the printing press as well. But when I was talking to her about it, and you said we were just so sick of being humiliated and demeaned in this way. It was so dispiriting. And it was just a rise up of, we're going to stop this. Poor old Canberra Times, there was one editor on his own when these women marched in.
There were about 300 of us. So.
And of all backgrounds, trade unionists, Conservative, Libs, National Party, local government, everybody, just en masse.
En masse. And I just got to add, because it's so lovely, Elizabeth was being interviewed on A Current Affair a couple of nights later about the Women in Politics conference, but she was asked by a haughty interviewer if that form of protest against news organisation was appropriate. And she said yes. Yes, it is appropriate. It doesn't, and she added, it doesn't change things now, but it does change women. I was so spot on. Sorry, your question.
I was just wondering, did you edit the movie during the sort of COVID period? And because did they give you sort of extra time for introspection and to perhaps really, get down into what it is? Because it was such a weird time and so many normal things were suspended. Do you think that perhaps gave you a different, I don't know?
Well, we were actually started editing it in 2019, so before COVID. But I do remember the day we all had to go home and work from home because we're still editing it. But what I remember strongly is that the Black Summer bushfires were occurring while I was editing it. And I was really in hell, feeling like I was in over my head with this story. And did it even matter? Because look at the state of climate change. That's what I remember. But yes, going into lockdown, I didn't get extra time for introspection. We'd taken longer than we were allocated to edit the film, and it was really hard because we're using the words of the women themselves. So I can't tell them what to say, but I have to edit it in a way that's cohesive. So ABC made me do a 1 hour cut down, which is the version that you're going to see, and they wanted a host. So Sigrid Thornton, Merle Thornton's daughter, is the narrator, and I actually learnt some convenient lessons about why a narrator is helpful.
Questions? Any other questions? Pop your hand up. Please pop your hand up. I think we had some. Was this one over there? While you're thinking about popping your hand up, don't be shy. Catherine, what sort of response did you get to this film when it first came out? And as I said before, because no one had done this before, no one had pulled this story together before in such a grand way. How did people respond?
I think people responded really well, and I was really pleased because until we finished it, I didn't know if it worked or not. And I'm not entirely happy with it. There are things that I intended to do with it that I didn't achieve. But no, the response was wonderful, and it was. But it was during lockdown that it came out. So all the press I did was via Zoom. So it was definitely. I thought I'd finally get to go back out into the world after being locked away for so long. But no, I had to stay locked away for a while longer.
When you say, things in it, or things that you didn't achieve, I mean, I don't know, what creative ever finishes a project or a book and says, I've done everything I wanted to do. I mean, I think everyone feels like that there's always more that they could do or more that they should have done.
Sorry, I just want to say, but what was wonderful, even though it was in COVID, and we all went through it, so we all know what that was like. The 1 hour cut down that I did for the ABC came out in March 2021, International Women's Day, and the timing was perfect because it was just before the March for Justice. It was just perfectly timed, I think, and we didn't expect that. We didn't know that the timing would be so perfect. But I remember Joe O'Brien, the newsreader, had tweeted that he'd just called his 90-year-old mother in Queensland, and she said, "Can't talk right now, watching Brazen Hussies and reliving it all." And I love that tweet.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. The timing was extraordinary. It was meant to be because it really did help. As I said, and I argue in my book, there was a national consciousness raising going on, and it helped background that, I think, and gave people a broader understanding of liberation and revolution.
Yeah, that reminds me, like Claire Wright, the wonderful historian, I'm probably misquoting her, but something like this. She said that women need to know that we're not just making history, but we have made it. We've made it in the past, and it gets forgotten. And if we don't keep telling these stories and remembering that we made history, then how do you know what you're capable of?
Precisely. It's a theme of my book too. Did you approach Germaine Greer?
I didn't, no.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I'm sure that would have been a discussion at some stage.
I mean, I didn't try. Though if I had a connection, I'm sure it would have been interesting to meet her. But I didn't think that she... I mean, obviously her book brought a lot of women to the movement and was internationally huge. And the Town Bloody Hall film with Norman Mailer is incredible, and she's wonderful in that. But she wasn't part of the grassroots movement in Australia, so that's why... And, I didn't think that she needed... her story was well known. But then I remember that there was a version of the edit that just didn't have her at all, and our executive producer, Sue Maslin, said, you can't tell this story without having Germaine Greer in it.
Oh, Sue was wrong.
Biff said she was wrong. We have another question up the back. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for being here tonight. I really appreciate your time and coming out here and sharing this with us, and especially the idea of liberation as opposed to equality has really resonated with me. But I just was wondering what your thoughts are on, I still come across women who don't believe that we need to make progress or avoid wanting to have a voice and acknowledging that there still is progress that needs to be made. And I'm sure it would have been even worse back then. So I would like to know your thoughts on the conversations and how you approach those conversations with other women who didn't have the same ideas as you.
Thank you. Great question. Biff, would you like to?
Yeah,
and
I'd love to.
Elizabeth also?
I sort of only in recent years really realised that my thing all through these 55 years, has been recruiting. Like I want every woman to be there, and I also now am wise enough to know they won't ever all be there. Trad wives and people this, but I think every woman potentially can be there one day. Like, it's got to be the right issue, place, time for her, and safety. Because I was so interested in this issue, long ago, I decided, this is just my stuff, that rape and war were the two things that probably all women agreed on. And that they've been my sort of issues, the things that I've followed through. And I think while war's getting more complicated, terrible, complex all the time, I think the sexual predation stuff is basic, crucial, because it's in every woman's body. You know, we live with that fear. You know, it's part of being female, and I believe that at some point in time, every woman has to acknowledge that. You know, like, so I think that's a place to work for me, and I think all feminists find their own place. You know, it was another one of the things about women's liberation. What you were good at, you go and do it. You know, do that, rather than we all have to do the same thing. But that's my offering, is around this sex stuff, the predation.
Elizabeth, did you want to add to that?
No, I think that...
It does raise the question, which I think we should perhaps finish on, is where all of you feel we are now for women and feminism. And look, Catherine, I'll start with you and we'll finish on this one. But given, and again, from a millennial generation, where do you, post your film, the reaction you've had to it, where do you feel feminism is today in Australia?
That's a tough question. And I think it's hard for me to actually gauge that because went down the rabbit hole and researched this history so thoroughly, you sort of can't remember what it's like to not know this stuff. But I do, it's complex. And I think I had this very optimistic idea about progress that I don't have so much anymore. But I do, working on the film in America about the American movement as well, like the fight to protect Roe v. Wade has always been there and has always been on a knife's edge because of the state's control over abortion. But I never would have expected that things would have gone backwards like so fast from that film, which came out in 2014 and took 20 years to make. So it's terrifying, the backlash. And I do tend to think of it as a pendulum swing. So if you get progress, if you get reform, and what an incredible time the 70s were with Whitlam for Australian women and the women's movement, because America didn't have that. They had Nixon who vetoed their childcare bill. So, yeah, what an incredible time. But things can go backwards quickly. But the pendulum, and it's not surprising that there's a backlash when things move forward and progress. So it's a dance, and you got to keep fighting. And sorry, there's been so much progress, but there's still so much more to do. And it's that you know, I think it's about seeing more women in leadership positions and being part of community decisions, and keeping up the good fight. I don't know, I could just go on.
Keeping up the good fight. As I say, revolution is unfinished. Biff?
I think, I know this sounds Pollyanna-ish, and I often say that. No one ever says, oh, yes, you are, so maybe it's all right to say. That the horror of the backlash of the really alt-right, incel, women, you know, feminists are the worst people on earth, backlash, I can only actually think it's, apart from the base level of misogyny it comes from, that it's a measure of our success.
Yes.
In fact, you know, like,
Precisely.
we're so angry with you. Yeah, what have we done to you? You know. So there's something in that. And I also have absolute deep trust in the younger women of all generations are younger than me, doing it their way and keeping going. You know, like, it's never going to be a cakewalk.
No,
You know,
definitely.
and those young women we've seen in recent years around the Western world speaking up, and that older woman in France, you know, it's like
There is a lot to be optimistic about, I believe.
hugely.
Elizabeth?
I think that I agree with Biff. I think there is a lot to be optimistic about at present. I think that the point of having a knowledge of one's history is that one can see what was thought to be essential by women in the past. So probably we would think that individual women will have limited impact. If you want to have more pressing impact, you've got to find ways of coming together. Now, coming together well taught us you can have small groups, 4 or 5 women, everywhere across Australia, in every small town, large town, medium town, rural areas, camp, site, etc. So that those groups can they'll work out their own practices and things, but a simple sharing of stories, they can themselves work out what are the greater influences in the world of women. And I don't want to exclude men. We used to say that if you can improve women's lives, the flow-on benefits hit all society because it improves the lives of their children, their husbands, their families, and so on. So part of the story used to be, and I think still could be today, that to improve women's lives means that some of the harder edges might be softened in the world, the edges of the world we live in.
Can I just point out that Catherine's film, the wonderful Brazen Hussies, ends with Martha, the marvellous Martha from Sydney, saying, get into groups, form groups. And that's the sisterhood stuff.
Yes, and I think young women, it's certainly my experience of researching this and interviewing a number of young women, is that they are really understanding and seeing that, the value in that, of working together now in a collective way that, you know, we hadn't been doing over the last couple of decades. Unfortunately, we are going to have to leave it there because we do need to take a break, and I'll call on Alison again.
Well, I think if we needed evidence of the sustaining power of sisterhood, we've had it in bucket loads tonight. Can everybody thank our panel, please?